Okay, a quick note before you listen to this podcast. This is a very unique episode I recorded with my friend Blake Cohen. He was in Israel for a week, and he's going to share with us the pulse of the nation as he perceived it when he was there. Because Blake is in Denver and I'm in the Torch Center in Houston, Texas, we had to record it asynchronously. And the plan was that I would record it on my device and him on his device, and then we would merge them together. But alas, there was a little bit of a technical problem. So thankfully we had a backup. We had a redundancy. We actually used the Zoom to record it as well. But the audio quality is quite poor, particularly on my end. Now, thankfully he did most of the talking. He's going to be sharing his story. He did most of the talking, but I have to warn you, I strive in all my episodes to try to have pristine audio. This one is not an example of what we strive to do. So unfortunately, the audio is not great, but it was a very powerful story that he told about what he experienced when he was there. And I think it's particularly useful for us who live in the diaspora to hear what's actually happening on the ground, what's the pulse of Israel. So I hope you enjoy it. If you can tolerate the poor audio, if you can't, I totally understand that. Maybe this is not for you, but you've been forewarned, and I apologize for that. We're still trying to figure out how to do these remote interviews in a more consistent way. This is not the first time it's happened, so forgive me for that. Of course, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com, and I look forward to your questions, your comments, and your feedback. Here is my conversation with Blake Cohen on the pulse of Israel. I am here with a special friend of mine, a first-time appearance on the podcast. It is great to have you on the podcast. How are you doing, my dear friend, Blake Cohen?
I am excellent. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course, Blake is an old friend, a listener of the podcast as well. We've become friends over the years. And he's one of my friends that I always say, I have to try to find a way to get him on the podcast. And we actually had an aborted attempt a couple of months ago. You recall, we were going to do a podcast. It didn't work out, but now it's here. Please God, we'll have a wonderful, enlightening conversation. I'm looking forward to it. You were in Israel recently. Is that right?
Yes, I was. I just got back actually yesterday morning, and I was there for a week.
Yeah, and just we're recording this on Wednesday, November 22nd. I think we'll probably release it maybe early next week, but just to have a sense. You went to Israel, and you went there because you wanted to help, to pitch in a little bit with the effort, also to get a sense of what's happening there on the ground. Is that right?
Yeah, I think like a lot of Jews around the world in the diaspora, after seeing what happened on October 7th, it was so shocking and so horrible. And we all wanted to help in some way. Everybody I knew wanted to help. And I heard a statistic that American Jews sent $600 million to Israel within the first couple of weeks after October 7th. And, it was kind of the only topic of conversation amongst myself and my friends during that time. But it's, I'm sure everybody can relate. There was a real sense of impotence, a real sense of helplessness at knowing that this was happening to our Jewish brothers and sisters in Israel, and kind of being stuck here and not being able to participate in whatever it was that they needed on the ground, fighting, or, volunteering, or, I didn't even really have an idea of what could be done. And then I did see someone, Antonio Garcia Martinez, who is kind of a public intellectual and founder of tech companies, and he himself is a podcaster, and he went to Israel and did a little reporting on what he saw there, as well as a couple local people here in Denver went. Your friend, our friend in common, Rabbi Gelman, went to Israel and reported a bit. So I knew that it was possible that people were going there, and but I didn't know that I was going to have an opportunity to do that. And when this opportunity did come up, um, I had to jump at it.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing statistic. Like you said, $600 million. That's not an insignificant chunk of change, but also, we're a nation, but we're really just a large family. And I think that's one of the unique hallmarks of our people is that we really feel connected with each other, even if we don't know someone and we don't really, maybe they come from even a different camp, they vote for a different political party, or they have a different religious orientation. We still feel like they're our brothers and sisters, and you have to use your words. And to see them over there, you just feel like you want to be there, you want to help contribute. I know my son, I think I might have mentioned this on one of the podcasts. My son told me, like, why would I ever want to go to Israel? There's a war. I said, now is specifically the time that I want to go. What am I doing here? Our brothers and sisters are there. I want to be there with them and contributing. And you actually went.
I actually went, and there was depending on what generation you come from, you'll either remember when Sean Penn went to Afghanistan to see it for himself, or more recently when Elon Musk went to the Mexican-American border to see it for themselves. I didn't want to be that guy. You don't want to be the person inserting yourself into something that really you have no business inserting yourself in, and you really don't have an adequate understanding of. And I was worried about that would be the case, that I'd be putting myself somewhere I wasn't needed or wanted, where I was in the way. But what you said about our connection to one another as Jews has never been brought to such sharp a point as it was when I was in Israel in the last week. Far from feeling like I was in the way or like I was a fifth wheel. And I'll mention, I was on a trip with 60 or 70 other people. I think that we felt the people that we met with, soldiers, displaced people, just regular citizens that we met, they were so deeply appreciative and grateful, and it gave them such strength that we were there and had come there during this time. That was, the most moving part of it, really, and really brought home the realization that we are one family. And this is how we have survived 2,000 years of exile. And it
And
is
did you
what
get a
gives us strength.
sense? Did you get a sense, Blake, that feeling of camaraderie and kinship and brotherhood that you felt from the locals there, did you feel like they had amongst each other? Because as we know, Israel the last couple of months before this terrible event, it was riven with a fracturing, a schism, a fight, really the likes of which we haven't seen in a very long time. And of course, there's political factors in it, and this whole judicial debate, but all these protests, and Israel in itself is a very unusual marriage of so many different types of Jews. In the sense I'm getting, but I want to hear from you because you were there and you got a much closer appreciation. Do you feel like some
Yeah.
of those rifts are mending?
Yes. It really is remarkable because I followed the judicial reform protests and movement pretty closely. And I was very worried, and I tried to convince myself that it was all going to be okay, that, in the end, there would be some compromise made. And that was the only way for, Bibi to continue his career, was to find a way to make a compromise. But I was still pretty worried about it. And it's just fascinating that on October 6th, the day before the massacres, it felt like the country was coming apart at the seams. And I will say that there is a range of feelings about how this is going to play out when the war is over. But by and large, and especially amongst the troops, there is a feeling that those disagreements will be far less upfront than they were in the past. We spoke to a couple soldiers at one of the bases we went to, and one of the guys was pretty far left. The other was pretty far right. These are, buddies and fighting in the same unit. And they said that in the days that they have been working together as a fighting unit and just talking constantly, they realized that their differences of opinion were, 10, 15, maybe 20%. And that it was the 80 to 90% that they agreed on. And so I think that because the fighting force is so large, I think there are 350,000 reservists, and plus the regular army, which is, I'm not exactly sure, 100, 150,000. You've got 450,000 soldiers who are together, in these, under duress, in these very difficult conditions with literally life and death stakes. And I think that they are realizing that they're much closer together than they thought.
And they say that the IDF is somewhat of a melting pot where it takes the different factions of the community and kind of forges them into one kind of Israeli ethos, in one unified culture. And the real battle is over what that culture is all about. And I wonder if that's maybe evolving now over the course of this war, as a lot of the flawed concepts that dominated a lot of the orthodoxy, not in the religious sense, but in the kind of the geopolitical and regional sense, a lot of that really went up in flames over the course of October 7th and what we learned subsequently.
Yeah, it's definitely a melting pot. The range of people I met in uniform, from Kolel guys who barely spoke English and to guys in the high tech sector, to people on the left, people on the right, people who lived in these religious communities in the West Bank, people who lived in Tel Aviv. I mean, it really throws you together in the most intense way. And like I said, I think they're realizing that their differences are smaller than their similarities. Now, that said, there is, and we'll say that towards the end of my trip, I spent some time in Tel Aviv, and there is somewhat of a Jerusalem-Tel Aviv divide, if you will. The Tel Avivians tend to be a little bit more liberal, a little bit more secular, a little bit more focused on the political implications of what's happening. They don't really take a biblical view of it as much. And I think that they're maybe a little more skeptical as to whether the unity, the newfound unity, can survive the end of the war, or to what degree it will survive the end of the war. But like I said, a lot of this, those were the people who were in Tel Aviv, not fighting. I think amongst the reservists and the army, and again, because the army is so large for this war, I have high hopes that the unity will prevail. Now, there will, it's Israel. It's a country like any other in some ways, even though it's a country like no other in many ways. And we're Jews, a people like any other in some ways, and a people like no other in some ways. There is going to be political disagreements, that's for sure. We have yet to see what the fate of this government is, what the fate of Bibi is going to be. But I do think that in large, they've realized that there is a common enemy, and they can't take their eye off that ball anymore. And that in the end, they're all Jews, and they want to see one another succeed.
Yeah, I want to go through your itinerary, your journey bit by bit. But before I want to ask you just another introductory question. I wasn't there, right? But I've been trying to keep tabs or to try to be plugged in as much as I can what's actually happening on the ground. I mentioned in some of my other shows that I tried to watch some Israeli television in the original Hebrew to not get the foreign spin on it, to get more like a local spin. And one of the recurring themes is that there's been somewhat of a religious renaissance in the land. Now, I know that back in the Six-Day War and its aftermath, and the Yom Kippur War and its aftermath, In both of those instances, there was a dramatic renaissance of religion. People saw things and they witnessed things and they underwent things. They saw miracles, and that awakened maybe somewhat of a dormant religious spirit within them. From what I've seen as an outsider, it looks like this current conflict, both the events, the terrible, awful, brutal events of October 7th, but also the war, it seems to me like what I've heard, what I've again encountered as an outsider, is that there has been an insatiable demand for tzitzis, and people want to wear tefillin, and people saying Shema Yisrael, and everyone saying Bezrat Hashem with the help of the Almighty. Did you get a sense when you were there that there was somewhat of a religious awakening amongst the troops and amongst the populace?
You know, there's certainly some evidence to that effect. One of the things I'll talk about is our visit to the Shura Army base, and with Rabbi Atlas, who provides the troops with all of their religious accoutrements. And there has been high demand for tzitzit. But I would say that it depends on exactly what you mean by religious awakening. It's hard for me to tell, for very secular people, for instance, what the meaning to them is of wearing tzitzit or yarmulkes when they're serving and why they're doing that. It seems logical that with the largest fighting force Israel has ever assembled, and with their desire to have these religious articles, that this will be kind of a sticky religious reawakening. I don't think everybody that was secular previously is going to become Orthodox, but I do think that it's put people in touch with that aspect of being Jewish. And, for a lot of Israelis, that's not necessarily a central aspect of being Jewish or being Israeli, meaning the religiosity, adherence to mitzvot and halacha isn't necessarily central. But I do think that this has maybe opened some people's eyes to being open to that. And it'll be very interesting to see. As you said, previous wars have had that effect, 67, 73. And we did hear from a lot of soldiers about miraculous things they witnessed, but they've also witnessed horrifying things. So, I don't know. I think if anything, this will bring a deeper understanding and respect between the more religious and the less religious.
And of course, that is to be celebrated. Okay, let's go through your trip. You give us, again, you and I have not spoken, just for the audience. You just gave me a very basic overview. You said, hey, I went, let's go, let's record. I'm so excited. I don't know exactly what you did. So talk to me more about what the trip was like and some of the things that you encountered, some of the things you learned, some of the places you went, some of the people you met. Let's go through that because I feel like it could be very helpful for us as people who did not have that great privilege, in a sense of the pulse of Israel, the people, and the events happening right now to our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land.
Sure. And before I go through the trip, I'll talk briefly about how I ended up on this trip and who organized it. This trip was organized by Eish HaTorah in Jerusalem. And, from what I understand, they just thought, should we offer a trip? Is anybody going to want to come here? What will we do with them once they get here? And so they kind of put the APB out to their branches across the United States and Canada. And they figured they'd get 30, 35 people, rent a bus. They actually had a lot of demand. There were 70 of us who ended up on the trip. They needed 2 buses from all over the country and Canada. There were 5 or 6 of us from Denver, people from Detroit, New York, Los Angeles, New Jersey. There was a very large contingent from Toronto. That was the largest group by far. Apparently, they have a thriving Aish community up there. We were all, I'd say, in a similar boat, people who wanted to help. This opportunity presented itself, and we jumped at it. For me personally, it was my wife who got the email from a local Aish rabbi, Menachem Lehrfield, and
Friend of the pod.
she, a friend of the pod, exactly. And he had sent an email. My wife is on his email list, and she told me about it. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder why she's telling me this, because there's no way she would allow me to go on this trip. She's a pretty cautious person. Um, but then, she said, why don't you go? And I said, really? Okay, yeah. Why don't I go? And I signed up for it. And, I asked her, I said, why do you think it's important? I'm surprised that you you want me to go on this trip. Did you increase my life insurance policy? What's going on here?
Mhm.
And she said, no, I just, I will say, like many of us, since October 7th, I've had a difficult time thinking about anything else. I'm reading the news, I'm on Twitter, I'm on a couple different WhatsApp groups where I get updates. It's been hard for me to concentrate on other things. And, she said, I can't have you pacing around the house like a caged animal all winter. I know you need to do something. And she said, also, this will set a good example for the boys. And I was very grateful that she had this perspective. And of course, she's right. It's an important thing to do. And my boys were very scared, actually. They're 11 and 13 years old. And when I told them I was going, they just said, no, you're not going. I said, okay, all right, let me talk to the rabbi and try to get a sense of how dangerous or safe this is going to be, and then we'll discuss it. So I talked to Rabbi Lehrfield. He told me that we would be staying in Jerusalem, which is pretty safe. And we were obviously going to have armed guards with us the whole time. And his feeling was that it was relatively safe. Now, once we got there, we ended up very close to Gaza on a number of occasions, very, in the West Bank. So I'm not sure that it was, we weren't in Jerusalem the whole time, but still, my own calculus was Hamas has their hands full. The rockets, the amount of daily rockets coming into Israel had decreased a lot. So I wasn't too worried about that. As far as an escalation of the war from Iran and their proxies, like Hezbollah, I wasn't too worried about that either, because President Biden, the Biden administration, decided to send the 2 aircraft carriers and a nuclear submarine to the area. So I thought that the chances of that sort of escalation were fairly low. And I really thought that the most dangerous thing was being stabbed by a terrorist in Jerusalem, which has happened. There was a police officer who unfortunately died from a stab wound. And I know that a couple attacks have been foiled in Jerusalem. So I thought that was the biggest danger. But it was a danger that I was willing to accept in order to be able to lend a hand and provide my support.
Plus, if you're going to go, it's not a bad way to go. In a blaze of glory, dying for the Almighty because you're a Jew in the land of Israel. We'll take it. Okay.
That's right. That is the best way to die.
You didn't tell that to your kids or your wife, but
no, I didn't.
Okay, so
I did not.
You arrive in Israel, and what happened?
We arrive in Israel. We all arrive at a similar time. We meet in Ben Gurion Airport, which is quarter capacity, eighth capacity. The only
and most airlines are not flying, right?
I think it's only El Al and Lufthansa, and I don't think that Lufthansa has many flights going in and out. So it's basically El Al, and so it was very quiet. For those of you who have been there, there's that long ramp that you walk down or up, depending on if you're coming or going, and on that ramp was lined with photos of all the hostages. And we met gathered our bags. There were a lot of bags because everybody had brought extra bags filled with goods for the soldiers. Each unit has their needs. I know Rabbi Lairfield I don't know how many bags he brought, a lot. He used his mother's house in Miami as a staging for loading the bags.
They're bringing bags from just people who wanted to send stuff to Israel.
Exactly. They requested donations. I think they provided links to Amazon with exactly what product was needed because, for military uses, the products have to be just right. They have to be the right color, and the right specs. And it was everything from clothing, a lot of clothing, to headlamps, pocket knives, and multi-tools, all kinds of stuff, anything a soldier might need that they can't get their hands on. So we brought, between the 70 of us, dozens and dozens of duffels, each weighing 50 pounds, hundreds and hundreds of pounds of goods for the soldiers that were directly requested by different units stationed all over the country and, for exactly what they needed. So we brought those in, loaded the bus, and went directly from there to a company called Pantry Packers, which is a nonprofit in Israel that provides food to needy families. And in this case, they are now bringing food to displaced people. I don't really, I don't know what you call these. Is displaced people the right word? Is refugee the right word? These are people, primarily from the Gaza envelope, as it's called. There's a Hebrew term, which I can't recall, but
Otef Aza.
Yeah, Otef Aza, or the North. The North had to be evacuated as well.
I think there are hundreds of thousands of people who are not home.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Hundreds of thousands living in hotels. We visited with them, living with friends and family, living wherever they can. And you can imagine this is a very small country with this many soldiers. What this has done to the economy. It's had, a real effect on the economy, and there's no tourism. Tourism has ground to a halt. So in any area that relies on tourism, there are problems with earning a living. With any area that has a lot of soldiers who have gone to report for duty, oftentimes the breadwinner of a family, that creates problems. So really, the whole country has to kind of pull together to keep these people housed and fed and clothed, for that matter. And Pantry Packers, I know, also gets clothing together for these people, and it's deeply appreciated by everybody. So that was the first thing that we did. From there, we went to the hotel, kind of checked in, and then went to Aish, where we had dinner and were lucky enough to hear from a couple people with a lot of insight into what was happening. The head of Aish, Rabbi Yitzhak Berkovitz, he gave a very insightful talk, about what we were going through as a nation, as the greater nation of Jews, Am Yisrael, and that was incredible to hear him. And we also got to hear from General Doron Gavish, who was instrumental in bringing the Iron Dome and David Sling and other military technology into Israel. And he also answered questions at the end of his talk. Among the many interesting insights he has was the fact that, Hamas's goals in their October 7th attack, or their plans, were to penetrate very deep inside Israel. And I think that's an important thing to note, that, to do what they did took years of planning, billions of dollars, real coordination, and they had lofty goals. They wanted to get to Jerusalem. They wanted to get to Tel Aviv. Now, I don't know to what degree they really thought that they would be successful. I actually personally think that they were surprised by the level of success, if you can call it that, that they had. Um, and partly because of that, because they didn't really expect to get that far, this response has been much more than they can handle. Uh, but the
So
fact,
he was saying that they thought they had plans to go even further.
yes, and that documents on their bodies and communications that they've heard,
So
they know
what
that.
stopped them? Do we know what stopped them?
I think that, I don't know if it was General Gavish or someone else who they were not, once they crossed the border and once they were engaged in their lunacy, they ceased to be any kind of
Command and control.
rational, controlled fighting force. It really became kind of a free for all, and they didn't really have any kind of missionary discipline, um, which thank God they didn't, because had they maintained that with the IDF's slow response, they could have done a lot more damage.
Yeah,
Um,
when I was watching some Israeli television, I saw like a Middle East expert who I became now a big fan of. His name is Dr. Kedar, Mordechai Kedar, I think is his name. And he was saying that this operation, like you said, it was in the works for a long time, but it was supposed to be multi-pronged. From the north, Hezbollah was going to attack. The Syrian factions that are allied with Iran were going to attack. The Houthis were going to attack. And it was all going to happen simultaneously. They were hoping to bring Israel to its knees with this multi-pronged surprise attack. And he says that Hamas jumped the gun because of this music festival, this awful music festival that was happening. And they said, we're just going to jump the gun. And they did it without coordinating with their other partners, so to speak, on this venture. And they just went on their own. But um, that gives a sense, like the size of this calamity, this attack is just unimaginable. It's the worst attack ever, and it could have been even bigger. Again, this is his theory. I'm not taking any credit or attribution for it. Um, but yeah, like this, it's hard for us to even fathom. But it could have been even worse, and that's just
no,
absolutely
yeah,
terrifying.
I've heard similar things before, that this was supposed to be coordinated, and for various reasons it didn't go that way, and thank God. And I think that that's similar to previous wars Israel has had, where in part the incompetency of the enemies has allowed Israel to survive what otherwise might have ended the state.
Yeah.
If you look at how long it took the IDF to respond to this, even with how poorly disciplined Hamas was, um, if it had been a multi-front attack, it, the damage might have been much worse, and maybe it would have been impossible to overcome. So, I don't know if those are all examples of miracles or not, but it is pretty uncanny to see some of the mistakes that the enemies make in these situations.
And not to say that our side is free of mistakes, as has been well established and documented. But in addition,
Absolutely.
I want to point out, it's important to mention, that there were many individuals who grabbed their guns and headed south. When they heard about it, they heard about this infiltration. There are a lot of very brave soldiers, but also civilians that just jumped right in and took on the
Yeah.
danger head on.
Yeah, we had the pleasure of meeting with two of them one day, and hearing their stories, and I'll get to that later. But hearing their stories was really, truly incredible. And also, it's a good example. One of them is not religious, the other one is religious, and hearing some of the differences and kind of what they make of this was very interesting, and their responses to it. And I don't know if the way they've responded to this is all because of whether or not they're religious or not, but two guys who did very similar things on that day, saw very similar things, came away with some different perspectives.
Okay, so tell us more about what happened in your trip.
So Wednesday, our second day on the trip, we started out. We went to a place where we made sandwiches for soldiers. Now, this seems, like I assumed that a lot of my time there was going to be spent doing these kinds of menial tasks, stocking grocery shelves, picking produce, making sandwiches. And I was all too happy to do that if that's what was needed. But I will tell you, just the experience of making sandwiches for these soldiers in itself was incredibly inspiring and remarkable. And you show up to, we were doing it out of a restaurant called Aroma, which I guess is a fairly well-known Israeli chain. And I'm not exactly sure of the structure here, if this was donations by the owner of the restaurant, or if they were just letting, this volunteer group use their space. But in any case, you go there and the entire place is packed with Israelis, all just making sandwiches, just nonstop, just, total chaos. You have a handful of people who are kind of coordinating the whole thing. You show up as a volunteer, they tell you what to do, and you just get in the assembly line. And
this talk is making me hungry. What kind of sandwiches are we talking about?
We had tuna sandwiches, we had
okay, I'm out.
Sandwiches. I was on the roasted turkey and pastrami sandwich line.
Okay, that's closer.
Okay, you like that one? That one is good. I will say the bread was gorgeous, fresh bread. My job was to put the meat on the bread after someone else had put mayonnaise on it, and the next person put the tomatoes and pickles on it. And then the person after that wrapped them. And to my right was a 15-year-old girl who didn't have school and decided to come make sandwiches. To my left was a retired Orthodox woman who decided to come make sandwiches. Everybody was there. Little children, lots of little kids were there, like elementary school age kids, running around, helping, doing anything needed, bringing boxes back and forth, throwing things out, getting you extra ingredients that you needed. Lots of retired people, but also people, to their way to their shift at work or on their way home from their shift at work, who would just stop by for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour because they wanted to pitch in. Those who, were really physically unable to do anything too difficult. I have a great photograph of a table of 4 or 5 very old women, I don't know, in their 80s, putting stamps on bags so that you knew which kind of sandwich you were going to get.
We're going to include this picture in the description of the podcast.
We'll put that in there. I mean, it was just, it was just so inspiring, and to really, as the first thing that I really saw, out on the streets, this group of people pulling together and doing this. And, so many people have served in previous wars. So anybody you meet, whether it's the taxi driver or whomever, will show you a picture on their phone of when they were serving in 73 or in, one of the Lebanon wars. It's just so, as a society, they understand and empathize with what the soldiers are going through. And they know it's not abstract to them. They know that what they're doing makes a difference.
And it's amazing because if you think about it, like the war effort, you making sandwiches is a very, very marginal part of the war effort. It's important, of course, but even at such a distant part from the center, from the epicenter of the combat, you still feel like you're part of it, and you're still involved. You still feel that spirit of volunteerism and spirit of unity. It's still so palpable there. And I'm thinking just how far we are here in America. We're so removed from it, and that's really the benefit of that experience, to actually be boots on the ground. Even if you're not going to be close to the action, you still are part of it, and you still feel like you're within the collective effort of our people.
Absolutely. And it's, it's a substantive and meaningful thing to do. And you felt like that. And it's just making sandwiches, but it's important. And, and also lots of the people around me had kids and grandkids who were serving. Um, so for them, it's even closer, Yeah, a lot of them have served themselves, but the fact that their kids and grandkids are serving now, it's very, it's right up front for them, for everybody. So after that, we met with a representative from Hatzalah. I think I'm saying that correctly. Hatzalah is a volunteer ambulance service, essentially. And he talked to us about the organization, which I had never heard of, and is really just an incredible story of how this organization started, from a young man who, thought that ambulances took too long when he was 15 years old, bought a ham radio, listened to the police, uh, uh, the police station, and started to respond. He knew CPR, he saved some people's lives, and from there it grew into this very large organization that responds to medical incidents in Israel. And
We actually have a branch of Hatzalah in Houston, Texas, as there are
yeah,
in many cities, many large Jewish cities, relatively large cities and communities. They have local branches of Hatzalah, but it's an unbelievable thing. It's like I don't know if it's a uniquely Jewish thing, but it's something which really, I think, embodies the spirit of kindness and brotherhood and volunteerism that is one of the hallmarks of our nation.
yeah, absolutely. And they are becoming more well known in Israel, but they still are not actually they're not ubiquitous. But they're gaining ground every day, and I think after this they'll be even more well known. But they had first responders to these events in the South, and people who would just volunteer as medical care providers for Hatzalah went down and put themselves in harm's way to help the injured and to provide medical treatment to the injured. And when I say the injured, you have to realize that we're talking about amongst terrorists, amongst live fire, going into the breach, often getting injured themselves. And he told us a couple stories of miraculous heroism that saved lives for people
Amazing.
running down there, riding their motorcycles down there, their medical equipment equipped motorcycles, seeing an injured person and running into the heat of battle to try and save a life. And this was not uncommon among the Hatzalah members in the area.
Unbelievable.
And they also have the ability to set up very quickly field hospitals. And so a lot of the injured from the party and the kibbutzes were treated at these field hospitals. So, just another amazing facet of the gem that is the Jewish people that you just, might not notice, might not hear of, might not realize how important it is. And I'll mention not all the Hatzalah volunteers are Jewish, in Israel. Many of them are Druze or Arab or Christian. And, they contributed as well to this too. So, Baruch Hashem, thank God for them. They're incredible people who are really selfless. And that kind of selflessness was certainly a theme throughout the trip. And after that, our next stop was really, for me, maybe the most intense and impactful moment of the trip. We visited the Shura Army Base. This is, I believe, the Army base where the chief rabbi of the IDF is based out of. It is also the base where they prepare bodies of soldiers and people who have died in combat.
I'm just going to give a quick disclaimer. You told me this ahead of time that what you're going to talk about now might be a little bit disturbing to some people. So if someone doesn't have a stomach for it, maybe they should just fast forward a few minutes and if they want to avoid it. But go ahead. So Shura Army Base.
Yeah, so there were two parts of this tour. The first one was where we learned how the bodies were treated. And then the second part was, this is also the base where they house all of the religious equipment for the troops. And so I'll just kind of go in order. The first part, we were led by Rav Bensi Man, who works for Mizrahi in his civilian life. He's an Israeli. His parents are American, and he spent 4 years in England. And he came back. I can't remember if he came back for the war effort or before that. But in any case, he was telling us that he was very disappointed that he couldn't contribute to the war effort because of his health. And he didn't mention what aspect of his health precluded him from that, but just that he, felt an intense need to help. And about that time, he got a call from the Army, and they said, we need you at Shura Army Base. I think it is because, if I recall, he has some expertise in the laws around death and burial. And so he described for us his experience so far. Particularly in the days and weeks following October 7th, as you can imagine, we've all heard and read and seen videos of all the ways that the terrorists murdered people, shooting them, burning them, dismembering bodies, everything. And this army base is designed to, I guess in a difficult battle and in a war, you might have tens, maybe dozens of bodies that you might be required to process, if I can use that term, at a time, to prepare for burial. This certainly was not a base designed with the idea that there would be over 1,000, 1,200 bodies, Jewish bodies to prepare, not to mention 700 or so terrorist bodies, and the need to differentiate between those, which is extremely complicated in itself. So what he told us was that, in the first days, they actually had sugar trucks, or I guess there's a sugar company, a well-known sugar company in Israel, that the trucks are visible and recognizable to the average Israeli citizen. And these truckloads would come, and they would be full of bodies and remains, and oftentimes they would be in bags. And he would be unloading these bags, and some of them would be very heavy to 100 pounds or more, 250 pounds, and some of them would be very small, a few pounds. And the size and weight of the bag, would depend upon who was in there, an adult male or a child or a baby. It would also depend on how much of their remains were left. And each of these bags had to be opened. And this man and the people that work with him had to look in each of these bags and make decisions from there on how they were going to handle each and every one of these people who had been murdered. Just a job that is difficult beyond imagining. And they had to do this for weeks on end, every single day, go to this army base, pull out these bodies, look at them, try to determine how to identify them. That in itself is just, heroism to a level that I can't even imagine. And this is not, I imagine that a lot of countries, a lot of armies around the world would not necessarily go to these lengths. I know that they wouldn't. They wouldn't go to these lengths of making sure that you identify each and every body, treating them with the kind of dignity and respect that is required of Jewish law. One of the stories that we heard was that there were some remains that the army could not identify. Their equipment, their ability to extract the DNA from these particular remains, I believe it was because of the degree to which they were burnt, would not allow them to identify these bodies. So they took the remains to a lab in the United States and identified them at this lab that does have the technology to do this. And the lab technicians in the United States could not understand. They asked the Israelis who brought them there, so you're telling me that you just brought these bodies here just for these two people, just to identify them? Yes, they did. And that's the level of seriousness which would they take their job. There were a lot of women working on the base. The women's bodies and the men's bodies were treated by either women or men respectively. And one of the women spoke to us, and she said, that they essentially treat the bodies according to the laws of tznius, of modesty. They literally treat these remains of human beings as if they wanted to be treated while they were living. That's what she said, how they would want to be treated while they were living. So these people did this day after day after day, all day, every day, for weeks, working with these bodies, treating them with the highest level of dignity and respect, treating them within the bounds of Jewish law, making sure that every body was identified and differentiated from one another. That's one aspect of the job. Another aspect of the job is speed. They want to identify the bodies as quickly as possible and notify the families as quickly as possible. Because they don't want the families to find out from anybody but them. They want to make the first call and make sure that this family knows and has the time to come to the base and begin the mourning process. So that's another thing that happened on a near constant basis for weeks after October 7th. They had a separate room where an individual body is laid, and the family would come and begin their mourning process there, and then move on. But this was, hundreds of families, if not, and thousands of people who were on this base every day. The base had 17 rooms where they processed bodies. They had to subdivide one of the rooms and create an 18th room because of the volume of bodies that they were processing. And like I said, there were 700 terrorists or so, who, bodies that they believe are terrorists. They have to go through each one of those bodies with the same level of care to identify, to make sure that they are not inadvertently putting an Israeli amongst the terrorists. And at the time I was there a week ago, they had already found 18 Israelis among the bodies that they had believed to be terrorists. So that process will continue as well, and I'm sure still is. The man who led the tour, he told us that, the first day he went home and he took a shower and he couldn't get the smell off. And, they described the smell of this facility, which is just, really horrible to think about. And he called a friend and said, I can't get rid of the smell. And his friend said, it's in your head. You don't smell that anymore, but you're going to be living with this for a while. And the trauma that these people are going through who are doing this, they know, they're very aware of this, that they don't really know the psychological toll that it's taking on them. The IDF has provided, and the country has provided, a lot of psychological care for them and for everybody else involved in this. Many of the victims, their families, but that's a big part of this, and an important aspect of this is that, these are all sophisticated people. They know that this is not something that you can do with no toll, yet they go in every day and do it. Rabbi Mann told us that he started to get worried because he stopped crying, and it had been weeks or even a month since he had cried. And at one point he went home to his 3-year-old and he was playing hide and seek with his 3-year-old, and his 3-year-old hid under a sheet. And when he saw this, the dam broke. This was, it was a similar image to what he had seen working on Shura. And he just said, like, since then he's had no problem crying. It's the tears have come back, and they've come back, in force.
This is, like you said, it's act of heroism. It's called in the Torah, it's called chesed shel emes, truthful kindness. I'm sure you heard that term. The kindness that you do with the dead to help prepare them for burial, to help bury them, to accompany them in their funeral. That's the highest level of kindness, because you're not anticipating any reward, in the words of the Talmud. And I think it's maybe surprising to some people to hear, but the laws about burial and the imperative to do it fast, to do it with tremendous dignity accorded to the bodies, and to make sure that every part of the body gets buried. Like when someone dies, an old person, let's say, dies, and they have some catheters or things like that, those are buried with the body. People don't know that. Jewish law, every part of them, because there's a little bit of blood, a little bit of some secretions that are in those pipes, in those catheters, they go into the coffin as well. I just saw this a couple of days ago. The terrorists, they killed a lot of the party goers by this festival in their car. They burned out their cars. So there's dozens and dozens of these holes of burnt out cars. And this organization, Zaka, which I'm sure you encountered them as well. Zaka is the big organization that goes to terrorist attacks and takes care of bodies to prepare them for burial. They go and they try to scrape up and collect every little bit of the body, even the smallest bit of blood, to bury that as well, in accordance with the law. But I read this maybe yesterday or something like that. They couldn't get all the human remains out of these vehicles, and they made a decision to bury the actual cars. I don't know if you saw the story, which is
I did not.
first time it's I always saw the headline, but the first time it's ever been done. They're taking these hulls of cars, these empty, burnt out cars, and they're going to bury them because there's so much human remains just all over embedded into the walls of the car.
Yeah. Well, on the army base, they did mention that, how closely they're working with Zaka as well as other organizations, and how it really is a collective effort. But Shura and Zaka and what they do, to me, first of all, I'll tell you, I've never cried so much in a week as I have on this trip. I mean, it was just, you could not, everything was so emotional and so real. And I'm not a crier, but like it's the only way to relate to what's going on in an authentic way. And everybody, I mean, you didn't even have to look around. You just knew that everybody was crying, as you're seeing this among many other things that we've seen. But I think that why this particular experience was so powerful is, to me, this crystallizes what the Jewish people are about. That even in death, the amount of dignity and respect you have for human life is at the forefront of everything. This is that in tragedy, in the horrors of what these people see, this to me is what it means to be a light unto the nations, to show that the humanity, the importance of humanity, the primacy of human life, of dignity and respect for human life, to go to these lengths to acknowledge that these remains are the remains of a real human being, an individual, to be treated as individuals. It's in such stark contrast to the people who perpetrated these crimes and these murders. And it blows my mind that people can't see this, that there are so many people who fail to see this, who have such a difficult time recognizing this. And that's one of the reasons why I think that what they're doing on this army base, what Zaka is doing, what the people at Shura are doing is so important to get out there, because it really shows, the best of what we are as a people and what Torah is.
Yeah, it's one of the lines that we read in the Mishnah that really reverberates in the heart of our nation, is that if you save one life, you save the whole world. Every person has to say, the world was created for me. That's the value that we accord in a single life. And this is manifested, of course, in the hostage negotiations, because we'll give up 1,200 soldiers, 1,500 soldiers, what, for one? It turns out that might be a fair exchange, because the value that we place upon one life is really effectively infinite.
Yeah.
Now, when you were there, were they still doing this process of identification, body identification, or they had completed that?
It had slowed down a lot. Obviously it continues because soldiers are continuing to die, but they had finished most of the victims of October 7th. And at that point, I think they had turned their attention to the 700 bodies that they thought were terrorists. I'm not sure what they're going to do with those bodies. I have a feeling that the enemy will not care and won't really care if those remains are returned to them or not. So that process is ongoing. But, as we walked through the halls, I don't know if it was in my head or not, but I could detect a certain odor, a certain smell. They keep it very clean, but I did see, a clump of hair, that I just wondered where it had come from. And, it was a huge operation to
Mm.
go through that. Um,
Tell us more about
yeah.
the other aspects of this army base. So there was also where they housed all the religious paraphernalia.
Yeah, so this base, that aspect of the base is run by Rabbi Yedidya Atlas, um, who's been doing this job for a long time. He's a veteran of the 67 and 73 wars.
With a name like
Um,
that, he better be a worldly kind of fellow. Okay,
he's
sorry.
he's got the world on his shoulders at this point.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, he was a remarkable guy. Um, he has developed a lot of the religious equipment and gear that the soldiers use, including the tzitzit t-shirts, um, the little prayer book that the soldiers take with them, which he developed a plastic case for so that they can take it anywhere they go. They can take it into the bathroom with them, um, because it's encased. Um, and he also,
Just to clarify, every soldier is issued a prayer book. Is that right?
yes, yes, that's right. And they carry it in their chest pocket. It fits perfectly in their chest pocket as a plastic case. They can read it anywhere, anytime. Um, and there are 400
And just to
Torahs.
explain, if someone doesn't
Yeah,
understand, there's a prohibition to bring any religious articles or prayer books or Torah books into the restroom unless it is wrapped, really double wrapped. So you're saying that was that was the cover was designed to accommodate the halachic requirements to bring wherever you go.
exactly. And this base houses 400 Torahs, 200 of which were in the field when we were there, and the other 200 are in various states of being repaired. Um, and these are Torahs from all over the world. They had some famous Torahs in there, Torahs that have survived the Holocaust. But it was really incredible being in that room, um, with all these Torahs. We did a little Simchat Torah dance and song in there, which was really moving and incredible, and just to see how important this is, that even in the heat of battle and on the battlefield, that this is important to for religious reasons, for troop morale, um, and to really have that be part of the operation of an army, was really incredible. He's also developed portable libraries of Jewish texts that bases have requested, and invented a kind of case that you can kind of put them all in and make sure that every army base has its the Torah books that it needs. And Torah study is pretty regular among a lot of the troops. So to be able to keep up with their studies, you have a lot of people who would be studying in yeshiva or kollel who have been called up. Um, and so that was really incredible to see just the sheer numbers, hundreds of thousands of prayer books and tzitzit that they're providing to the soldiers. And yeah, that was really a special experience. And
It's kind of
Rabbi Atlas.
surreal if you think about it from a historical perspective. If someone told you like 200 years ago in 1823 that in 200 years there's going to be what 7 million Jews living in Israel and they're going to have an army where they have 400 Torah scrolls. If you told someone that 200 years ago, they'd say, okay, definitely Messiah came, right? There's no other way to interpret that.
Well,
There's something
there's that.
really beautiful and powerful and historical about it.
Absolutely. I'm sure many people have read Mark Twain's account of Palestine in the late 19th century or the middle. I can't remember exactly what year he was there, 1860, 1870. And he just describes the utter wasteland, the utter uninhabited wasteland that he experienced when he was there. I'd
Which I
love
will
for him to
tell
see
you,
this.
I will tell you. that that is predicted in the Torah. The Torah itself says that when we leave, the land will be desolate and barren and fallow and bereft of life and vitality. So it's a beautiful illustration of the predictions of the Torah actually coming true, where we left, and for a couple thousand years, or almost 2,000 years, obviously there were always some pockets of life and civilization there, but for the most part, it was empty. And look at it now; it's flowering, it's blossoming, and it's booming. And no one's going to say that it's perfect, but it is a beautiful thing to appreciate from a historical perspective. A 30,000-foot vantage point of history. It's a beautiful story of transformation.
Yeah, and an incredible and unique story of transformation. And Nachmanides, Ramban also, I think mentions that the land will never thrive until its children return to it. And he lived there, I guess in what is that, the 13th century, beginning of the 14th century. And it was pretty thinly populated when he was there
1260s,
as
if I'm
well.
not mistaken.
1260s.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he mentions that as well. And the sheer vibrancy of the country, from agriculture to high tech, it's undeniable.
Yeah, and I always say that when I went there, I've been there since we lived there before 2012. And I've been back now. I came once in 2015, 2017, 18, 19, 20, and then a couple of times last year. So I've been back, 7, 8 times. And ever since I started doing the podcast, I would go there and I'd bring my microphone and all my paraphernalia. And I actually was recorded by the Kotel in 2018. I went through the metal detector, and they like, so you can't bring that with you. And but the guy was on his phone and he kind of put it away. So I just grabbed it and went and bolted. So they could have arrested me. But then
Yeah.
at a subsequent time, I was in Jerusalem, and I'm like, there isn't a single quiet spot to record. There's nowhere. It's always loud and bustling, and it's alive and vibrant, and there's always construction, there's always people, and there's cars, and there's beeping. There isn't a quiet spot in the whole country. Well, the whole country, but the
Yeah.
most recent time that I went, I said I'm doing my podcast ahead of time. Sorry, I'm pre-recording. I can't bring my microphone there anymore. It's just too much noise and too much chaos. But
Yeah,
it
it's a
is
miraculous
beautiful. It is
transformation.
beautiful to see that.
Yeah. Um, so from there, we went to a hotel. I wish I could remember the name of the hotel. It was a large hotel. It was a nice hotel. And it's housing the families from Shlomit, which is part of a larger group of religious communities in the Gaza envelope. And we heard their story. We met with one woman in particular who was widowed that day. But this is, one of the things I love about Israel is the variety of religious practice and the variety of ways of being an observant Jew. So this is one of those communities where, all the women have these beautiful head wraps and dresses, and the men are all wearing like jeans, t-shirt, tzitzit, a woven yarmulke, Birkenstocks, and of course an Uzi, or whatever the M16s I think they carry, in Israel. That's what the IDF uses. And they're young. It's a young community. Lots of little kids, and they're all housed in this hotel. And you get there, and the first thing I noticed was that it was very loud. Lots of kids running around, playing, yelling, crying. The mothers all walking around trying to figure out what's going on. And this whole community has been put in this hotel. And, thank God they have a place to go, but it can't be comfortable. In any case, we talked to one woman, or one woman addressed us. And it's funny because one thing that she had stayed with her family for a while, but then she felt separated from her community. All her friends and her kids' friends especially missed their friends. Her kids missed their friends, and they decided to move from her father's house to the hotel. And she mentioned that the one thing that was so hard was that it was so loud all the time. And I can understand as a parent, it's a lot. It's a lot to be. You don't have a lot of privacy. Um, you don't have your own home, your own stuff, and it's really it's not easy to be displaced like they are, away from their jobs and their work. I think it's an agricultural community when they come from where they come from. So I think a lot of them work in that field. And a lot of the men are in reserves now. And then we talked to another woman from the community who was widowed that day. And basically what happened to this community was that they heard what was happening. But nobody had a sense. Nobody really understood what was happening. Is it a few terrorists? I don't think anybody understood for hours or days even that it was, thousands of terrorists that had infiltrated. So the 12-man security detail from this kibbutz or community got their weapons. They heard that a neighboring kibbutz had been attacked, and I think the neighboring kibbutz was mostly elderly. So they went up and didn't have their own security detail. So they went up to this kibbutz, which was a few kilometers north of where they were, to protect that community. And they actually managed to fight so fiercely that the terrorists left. However, one of them died in the fighting, and it was his widow who addressed us. And like so many of the Israelis that we met, she was incredibly grateful and strengthened by the fact that we were there and that we cared. And, people who have been through something traumatic, it's so obvious to me now that to share how important it is for them to share their story and to feel like they're being heard, and to feel like they're being heard from people who, genuinely and authentically care for them and want to hear their story. And I can tell you, everybody that we listened to, you could hear a pin drop. That really became for me why we were there, was to listen to people and to acknowledge them and to really receive what they needed to give. And, she was just an inspiring person. She has 6 kids, and she wants to move back there. And, she really wants to make sure that her husband's death wasn't for nothing. And, I know that personally, and I think I speak for everybody that was there, it's definitely not. The inspiration that we all got from his self-sacrifice, his bravery, and he was a very important member of the community. He was, I think the incoming chair of the community, the incoming head or president of the community, widely beloved, widely respected, and just a real loss for everybody.
And what about the rest of the people? Like, are other residents that you met from the Gaza envelope as determined to go back, as determined to rebuild? Or did you get a sense that some people were saying, we're done with that? The country failed to guard us, to protect us. We're out.
I think that for those who do not want to move back, the primary reason is their children. Depending on the age of the kid, certainly kids in between, I would say 7 and 13 or 14, who really understood what happened. It's very scary for those kids. And a lot of those kids, I think it would be very difficult for them to feel safe going back to their home. It also depends on the degree to which the community witnessed atrocities. This particular community did not witness very many atrocities, or any really. They managed to escape because of that 12-man detail that fought the terrorists off. They suffered a very serious loss with this man who died. But that's different, I think, than Be'eri or some of the other communities that witness more violence. So it's hard to say. It's really hard to say who will return and who won't. I think in the main, those communities will continue on and a lot of people will move back. I don't know what will happen with a kibbutz like Be'eri, which, a huge percentage of the population was wiped out. There aren't even enough people left from there to go back and rebuild it. You'd need new people. So I don't know, but whatever decision they make, I'll totally understand and respect. And, no human being should ever have to make a decision like this. Let me just look here, see what the next thing was. Oh, I'll mention, that these were the first people we had met who were kind of refugees because of what had happened. And one thing that I noticed throughout the trip is there wasn't a lot of overt cries for revenge. Vengeance wasn't top of mind. I sensed no what I would call bloodlust at all. There was some anger for sure. A lot of it directed towards, the government, for not being there, for taking so long to respond, for not seeing this happening. There was an incredible amount of disappointment. Disappointment at, the naivete of the country, the naivete of some of their own communities, the lack of preparedness, but there wasn't bloodlust. There wasn't a deep need to avenge themselves. And I heard something. Hashem Yikom Hamam. May God avenge their blood. Gamam.
Yeah.
May God avenge their blood. And I thought that was interesting because it doesn't say, may we avenge their blood, but may God avenge their blood. And I think that was kind of under the surface in a lot of the conversations that I had with people. Like, look, we have a mission as a people. We have a mission as a country, which is to build this country, to build up the Jewish community, to be Jews, to be a light unto the nations. And yes, we have a duty to protect ourselves and we have a duty to defend ourselves, but vengeance will leave to God. I really felt that. Like, and I'm sure that there are individuals and individual soldiers who are extremely angry and would like to take vengeance into their own hands. But in the main, I was surprised at how little of that I heard. How rational and matter of fact so many of the soldiers and citizens were in terms of what they have to do now as a country to defend themselves, to destroy Hamas, and taking care of that business that's in front of them. And their ability to differentiate between that and, there's a variety of opinions on to what degree your average Gazan is a sympathizer or supporter of Hamas. I think the general feeling is that that's pretty ubiquitous there. But obviously at some point you are an innocent child, and certainly there are people there who are probably very anti-Hamas. And the Israelis keep this in mind. The soldiers keep this in mind. And I think this this experience went a long way to breaking even some of their own naivete. Like one person said to me, like, look, we knew they weren't our friends, but we weren't expecting this at this time. And so I think that, like happens when something like this happens, there is a general, it wakes you up to the reality of who your enemy is. Something that you can forget because you don't think like them. The Israelis don't think like them. They don't think in those terms. And I think it's hard for us to remember that there are those who do think in those terms. They do think in genocidal terms. They do think in a way that doesn't value life. But these kibbutzniks, as well as the others that we met, I have a pretty sober view.
And I will add maybe that if someone does feel the urge for revenge, I think that it could be justified. I'm not saying I think that yeah, we do outsource our revenge to God, Hashem Yikom Damam, but I don't. I had someone who asked me a question like right soon after the attack, is feeling a desire for vengeance okay? And I said yes, because again, God takes vengeance, and that's obviously a proper way to do it. And definitely cannot allow such an event to not make an impact on you. So you have to acknowledge it, and I think that if someone does feel an urge for revenge, it's not an improper feeling per se.
No, I agree, and I certainly wouldn't judge any of them for what their feelings are, given what they've experienced. And even those who wanted vengeance, they wanted vengeance on the killers. They did not want. Nobody wants to go on a killing spree of the kind that Hamas engaged in. And
yeah, look at it. We've been the Jews have been in the land in large numbers for let's say 100 years. Okay, already 100 years ago there was 100,000 Jews there, and there are hundreds of instances where the Arabs came and indiscriminately targeted innocents. How many instances are there of the reverse? There's only one claim, and that's the massacre in 1994 of Baruch Goldstein. And even that, some people claim that he thought there was a terrorist attack that he's trying to prevent. And we're not going to condone such behavior. That's not our way. But it's unbelievable when you contrast these two warring peoples, and one of them, they have this insatiable bloodlust where there are literally hundreds of instances where they deliberately targeted and tried to kill individuals, civilians, and there are effectively none in the opposite direction. So we definitely have a very different culture and a very different set of values, and that comes to the front in times like this.
Yeah, it's stark. So to continue the theme of differences of response to this kind of thing happening, that night we had dinner with a bunch of young entrepreneurs who are already working on solutions to anti-Semitism, to preventing these kinds of attacks in the future. Just another facet again of the gem that is the Jewish people. These young people who see a problem and immediately begin to work on solutions. One of them was working on solutions to anti-Semitism in social media. Ways of responding to that without using kind of soulless bots to just respond to everything. Ways for individuals to kind of apply their own personality and perspective on countering these anti-Semitic narratives on social media. And I don't know all the names of these companies off the top of my head, but for the notes to your podcast, I'll get you links so that you can provide them for people. And one guy I talked to He is a founder of a company that has developed a device that decreases friendly fire, which is the largest cause of death in the IDF, and I think the largest cause of death in many armies. So this is a device that goes on your gun, and if you point your gun at a soldier who also has this device, your gun will vibrate. Like, I don't know if you've played video games where the controller will vibrate. And, they thought about
Like
doing,
laser tag. You play laser tag. You
yeah,
can't shoot your own teammates.
yeah, like laser tag, basically. And he's, raising funds for this business. But it was just, it was their energy and intelligence of the whole population is just remarkable. And everywhere you go, you come across it. The level of education and innovation is really incredible. So, we had that dinner. I got to meet a bunch of really smart young people. At the end, a young woman had mentioned that her brother's unit needed certain to upgrade their rifle sights, and she had been raising money for that. Of course, when we heard that, we did an off the cuff auction and raised the last $7,000 or so that she needed to get the rifle sights for her brother's unit. So that was really inspiring to see. The next day, we got to go to another nonprofit and pick vegetables. So we got to go and dig in the dirt and harvest sweet potatoes. And this is a nonprofit that usually is providing food for the needy, inexpensive vegetables and healthy foods for poorer families. And now, they've pivoted a little bit to providing food for refugees, displaced people, and it's a great organization. I think it's called Leket. Again, another link I will provide for your listeners in case they want to donate. But that was amazing. You're in the fields, you're picking sweet potatoes, you've got your hands in, Eretz Yisrael and pulling out these giant, gorgeous sweet potatoes. And, I was working with a couple Israelis, maybe in their 60s, who were both tour guides, and not a lot of tour guiding going on right now. So this is how they're spending their time, going out to volunteer. They were both veterans of previous wars as well. And it was just great spending time with them, hearing them tell stories. They know, these tour guides, they're so well educated, well trained. They were telling all kinds of stories about the history of Israel and farming and agriculture in Israel. And that was just another incredible experience. After that, we got to meet with an elite fighting unit called Team 5 or Unit 5. So this group of soldiers was created in the wake of, I think, the first Lebanon War, where the generals had been watching the war on television screens, and it caused problems. Even though in some ways they had a really great view of what was happening, they weren't able to really feel the war, feel what it was like on the battlefield. And they realized that there was no substitute for bringing the generals into the fray and seeing what was happening, getting a feel for it so they could make better decisions. So they put together this team. And what this team does is they send a number of soldiers into the battle to kind of clear space, make sure it's safe. They bring the general in, let him get a feel for what's happening, see firsthand what's happening, and then they take them out. Because this team is going in and out of Gaza multiple times every day, they can't break their routine to meet with us. So they just said, look, we have a training. You can come watch it. and then we'll spend some time with you after, but we can't like take an hour to just hang out with you. So we said, fine. So we got there, we all circle around one of the leaders. Some people were talking with some rabbis that were talking, and he had to tell everybody to be quiet and to behave like we were in the military. So we all got very scared and very quiet and very military, and it was really funny. And he just oh, and they held this training at a what was a British police station that was built in I think the early 40s. And so you can imagine this British police station that once imprisoned Jews. That was primarily who was locked up there, were members of the Jewish resistance to the, British mandate. And now it's being used for IDF soldiers to train. It looks similar to its concrete buildings. It's similar to what you would see in Gaza. So we walked in and we watched as they essentially ran this war game where they have the soldiers come in, they're throwing smoke bombs and bombs. They have one of the soldiers pretend to be injured. They bring the general in. Actually, who they chose to be the general? Rabbi Lairfield got to be the general, running in between, two soldiers in front of him, two soldiers behind him, in and off the battlefield. You see them pick up the injured soldier, bring him back, put him on the truck, and then drive away. It was very intense. It was very
What a
loud.
thrill.
It was thrilling. It was thrilling. And afterwards, they talked with us. Now, the doctor of this unit is, I think, 69 years old. And he moves very well for a 69-year-old. He's got to jump on and off the truck and lean over to treat the wounded soldier. And so, yeah, there is a what? I think the youngest was 19. The oldest is 69. What is that, 50 years? 50-year swing in the ages of the members of this unit. And then afterwards, they addressed us and they told us really how incredible it was that we came and that we wanted to be there and how grateful they were. And it's very strange to hear this. We're the ones who should be grateful. They're the ones who are putting themselves in harm's way. Oh, what does that say, Clarissa? I think my recording has stopped. I might have to, will you grab Miles? I don't know when it stopped.
Well, we have the redundancy here because it's still recording on Zoom.
All right. I'll see if he can, maybe he can send that, get it off his phone so we can try to get more of it, with the higher quality audio. Should we keep going or should I wait till Steve?
Yeah, let's just keep going. Keep on going.
Okay. So yeah, these elite fighters this unit, the members of this unit come from other elite units. So it's really a mix. Hey, Miles, can you see if you can maybe, I don't know. So the members of this elite unit come from all the other elite units of the IDF. And to hear them talking about how moved they were by the fact that we would come during this dangerous time, how much, what's the word? Is it chizuk? That they get?
Yeah. Strength, yeah.
Strength boost that they get from us being there. And these guys aren't actors. They're soldiers. It was so heartfelt that the way that they felt that we were there. This group of just regular Jews ranging in age from, I think maybe the youngest people on the trip were in their early 30s, up until, their late 70s. They really, they said it reminds them of what they're fighting for, around the world, that it's not just Israel. They're fighting for Jews everywhere. And then we were addressed by a Druze soldier who was one of the real, one of the most one of the best soldiers in this unit and one of the most hardcore guys. A couple of the other members singled him out as this guy is the guy you want to go into battle with. And he came out and he addressed us, and his English was not great. But what he said was, you make a choice whether to be a victim or whether to be a fighter. And we are making the choice to be fighters. And, he said, by coming here, you're making that choice. And it was really, it was just incredible. And this was one of those units that puts the lie to the idea that all Israelis are blonde-haired, blue-eyed European Jews. I mean, there were Ethiopians, there was Druze, there were Mizrahi guys. I mean, it was, really, it ran the gamut. It really was the full spectrum of Jews that you see in Israel, and they're all in this elite fighting unit, relying on one another. And then afterwards, you start talking to them, and you see that, most of these guys are in their 20s and 30s. A lot of them have families, wives and kids at home that they're leaving to go do this. A lot of them have businesses. They're entrepreneurs. And yeah, they're happy to talk to you about what it's like to go in and out of Gaza and what it's like to be a soldier and the methods of their fighting unit. But even more, they just want to tell you about regular life. We're talking to one guy who's wearing a mask. And I was talking to him, and he said, "Oh, you should talk to my brother. He has a startup also." So I went and talked to his brother, and I said, tell me about your startup. And he said, "Oh, we make a device that decreases friendly fire." And I said, "Really? I met your partner last night at dinner." And he could not believe it. His eyes got really big. He was like, "No way, that's incredible." And, I told him that I'm associated with a VC fund that invests in Israeli businesses, and I already passed his information on to them. And that's all he wanted to talk about. He didn't want to talk about fighting. He didn't want to talk about the war. He just wanted to talk about what he normally does in his life. And I talked to another guy, and I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "Oh, I specialize in finding like under market real estate deals." And I was like, funny thing, that's my business too. So we talked real estate. You're talking to these guys are in full military gear, I don't know, 70 pounds of gear on them, their gun, and they're normal people with families and businesses. And one realization I had, was just, how an army like this in a country this small it's not all professional soldiers or primarily professional soldiers. It's primarily people who are professionals in other fields who, because of their army service that they've done, have this expertise and can do this when called upon. But what are they looking forward to? Getting back to their family for Shabbat, going back home and playing with their kids. And that was a really big moment as well, because I'm looking at all these men and realizing that chances are some of them, God forbid, will not have that chance to return, will not have the chance to build the businesses that they're trying to build now. And I hope that they do all return. And I don't know what the fatality rates are in their particular unit, but that was a really tough moment for me. And I had to keep myself from crying because I didn't want, them to see that and to feel that, because for some, they have to put it out of their minds to go do this every day, and they're able to do that.
Tell me about the barbecue that y'all did.
Yeah. So the barbecue.
I was hungry when we talked about sandwiches, but now I'm like famished.
Yeah, that's right. So we were initially supposed to put on a barbecue for 350 soldiers, but for some reason that group of soldiers had to go. I'm not sure if they had to go fight or what happened. So it ended up being a bigger army base with 700 soldiers. And a very generous man from Detroit had donated the $7,000 it cost to feed the smaller group of soldiers. So then we had to raise money again on the bus to see who was going to pitch in to feed the rest of the soldiers, which of course we did easily, because we were all very happy to do this. So we went down to a base very close to Gaza. My wife can see my location on her phone. And so she sent me a screenshot. She was like, "You're really close to Gaza. You told me we're going to be there." I was like, "Look, I don't know. The bus driver points the bus in a direction, and then I get off and on when he tells me to. What can I say?" And they asked us not to film in this outside of the army base. We were allowed to film in it, and they had these giant walls that they had put up around it.
And this is a makeshift base. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. This is not a base that would normally be there. And you walk in, and there are just hundreds of soldiers of all ages, shapes, sizes, men and women, sitting around, looking at their phones, smoking, drinking, talking, eating. And you just kind of go in there and you just start talking to people. And again, the first guy I started talking to, his English wasn't great. I said, "What do you do?" He's a Kolel guy, and he's in military intelligence. And here he is, and we talked. I tried to talk Torah with him a little bit, but his English wasn't great, and he's many levels above what I'm sure what I would be able to understand anyway. He was studying Baba Basra. That's his book that he likes. And
Blake, you gotta take him on. You gotta defend the honor of the podcast.
I'll go back. I'll track him down after studying for a couple of years and see what I can do. Talking to other people who run businesses. I talked to one guy who is in Army engineering. And he said that he had really wanted to move to the United States, but that actually, since this had happened, now he wants to stay. And I had a realization on this base, which is that, the IDF is the most moral army in the world, probably the most moral army in the history of combat. And several people told me, often to the detriment of soldiers. They will put their own soldiers in harm's way and at risk to be as moral as they are and to be as careful to avoid civilian casualties as they are.
Which, in my opinion, is a mistake.
Yes, and I think many of the soldiers felt that way as well. But it is also unquestionably the most educated army in the history of warfare. The level of education that the average person has, and the regular troops are pretty young. They haven't been to college yet often, but they're the education that they get in schools in Israel is excellent. This was not, and again, I'm sure this happens, but by and large, the dignity and respectfulness of the troops. Look, I don't know that much about the military. I wasn't in the military in the United States either. Most of what I know from it is from movies. But this army does not behave in the way that you see armies behave in American war films. They're very dignified. They think, they talk a lot about politics. A lot of the guys on that base, wanted to engage in discussions about the political reasons that they were in this position they found themselves in. They wanted to ask me about what I thought was going on in the United States and the college campuses and academia and around the world with the, pro-Palestinian marches. They wanted to know about the march in Washington. These were heady conversations for soldiers who are going into battle. And, look, it could have been at a kiddush. That's how you feel talking to these soldiers. Like, these are just the same conversations and the same types of people that you'll talk to in shul for kiddush. And, it feels like family, feels like home. It's just, it's an instantaneous connection. And, another thing you're handing out, these letters, and pictures that we brought from kids. And it seems silly, like they're going to battle. You're going to give them it makes a difference. Like again, it gives them incredible physic, and it gives them strength, and they realize that we are all thinking about them and caring about them wherever we are in the world, and that we're watching them, and that we're praying for them, and the praying, like that is important for them. Even the ones that are, more secular, to know that we're out here praying for them was so important for them. Yeah, and that was a theme that came up a lot too, is they are seeing what's happening in the news. They're seeing the anti-Semitism that's out there, and they do feel embattled, and they feel lonely, and they feel abandoned in a lot of ways. And it's not good for their morale. So to go there and to let them know, like, look, I would tell them, nobody talks about anything else. The entire Jewish community can only think about what you are going through right now. And I'm one person, but I'm here as a representative of the entire 80,000 person Jewish community of Denver. And I can assure you that they are all with you and care about you. And more people would have come, and more people will come. And I think that's really
Especially after
important.
this podcast. After this podcast, I was like, I'm going.
That's right. That's right. And I would encourage anybody listening to this podcast, go, please go. We can put you in touch with people at AISH, or you can put together your own trip, but there's no reason for you not to go. It's a very important thing to do right now.
Let me ask you a personal question. You get a sense that maybe you belong there? Like I've been having this feeling the last couple of weeks. We lived in Israel for 5 years after we got married, and my three older children were born in Jerusalem, but we moved to Houston. And I did get a growing sense, just personally, a feeling that like I really don't belong here. I belong in Israel. Did you get a similar sense, or maybe other people on the trip get a sense that even though, we're from Denver or we're from Toronto, wherever we are, we really, our hearts are here, but really we should be living here as well?
I mean, yes, but I'll give the disclaimer that I've always felt that. But this definitely put a fine point on it. And I became very determined to find a way to buy some real estate in Israel. Um, and I don't know if I will move there right now. I don't think my wife or kids want to move there right now, but someday I would like to. I would like to have a place there. I think my boys are interested in going there after high school, either to yeshiva or to work, or um, whatever the case might be, to go to college. Um, and I'm very focused on that right now, on finding a way to buy real estate there. And I'll mention, I'm bearing the lead a little bit, but we did get to hear from Rabbi Beryl Wine on Shabbat, and he said, now's the time. If you're going to buy real estate in Israel, do it now. And he also said, even if you come here and just sit on a park bench, you're making a statement, which I thought was
The
an
legend
amazing.
himself.
The legend. He was a legend. All right, I'll continue on with a few more things that we did. We went to Gush Etzion. I'd never been to the West Bank before. This is a cluster of settlements kind of on the border of the West Bank. And one of the kibbutzes, we were on a kibbutz there, where we heard from two soldiers who had been first responders to the October 7th attacks. And these were among the stories that you hear about, guys who were not they weren't soldiers at the time. They were just civilians who had been soldiers, who were, in reserves, but not currently active in reserves, who heard what happened, grabbed their gun, drove down. And in one case, a guy called all the members of his unit. And they all met up down there, and they just started fighting. And again, more harrowing stories of what they saw, driving past all of the bomb shelters that are lined on the road going down there, where people had hidden, and as the terrorists went by, just would throw grenades into these shelters. And one of the men told us, it was 40 hours. He fought for 40 hours, just nonstop, no food, no sleep, just him and his unit, just trying to penetrate further and further and kill as many enemies as they could. And he was injured. He was shot. So he came in and he was on crutches. Um, and yeah, again, just total heroism, total selflessness. One of them had left his wife and kid to go down there and do this. Um, and life-changing experiences for them. Just picked up a gun and went down and fought, not knowing what they were going into, kind of realizing moment by moment the scale of what was happening. But even then, I think, they were somewhat in shock, and you're just fighting. And that's all you can think about. You're just, just the next moment in front of you. And then you kind of piece it together later, what was actually happening. But, God knows how many lives they saved. What they did to stem the tide and to keep the terrorists from penetrating further into Israel. Total selflessness, total heroism. And one of those young men, he really wore his anger on his sleeve more. And I think, again, it was a case where there had been some level of apathy amongst Israelis, or some level of distraction, or maybe not taking the enemy as seriously as maybe they should have. But I think it's fair to say that, God willing, it'll be another 50 years before, and hopefully never. Hopefully it'll never happen again, that as a country and as a people, we've learned our lesson that you have to be ever vigilant, and you can't let politics distract you, and you have to know the nature of the enemy, which is that they're not like us. They're not looking for peace. They're not looking to live side by side.
One of the flawed concepts that everyone's talking about is that they thought that if Hamas was in charge of Gaza and they had to run the sewage and the education and the communication, and they're responsible for food and water, that would make them forget about their other mission, or their stated mission, which is the elimination of Israel and the slaughter, really, of anyone that gets in their way.
Yeah.
We have to take our enemies for their word when they say things like that. We don't just attribute it to hyperbole, or some sort of exaggeration or embellishment.
Yeah. And I remember in the second Intifada, the disillusionment of the Israeli left and those who had been hoping for peace, probably myself among them. I'm not Israeli, but I've long been an observer of the peace process and of Israel, and hoped for peace. And I know that the second Intifada did a lot to mute that sentiment. It seemed like it had been coming back a little bit in recent years, or at least there was a polarization in Israeli society where you had those who were even less keen on it before. But, a lot of those kibbutzniks down there were hoping that they could be the bridge, that because of their relationships with the Palestinians, that they could show that this was possible and they could be the bridge. And I have no doubt that among those Palestinians that they interacted with were some good people, but by and large, those people were just used cynically. And some of those people even became informers on the kibbutz, letting the terrorists know the layouts of the kibbutzes and their weak points. And I think this is another event that is going to have a massive effect on the general approach of Israeli society to any kind of lasting peace.
Yeah, the peace process is effectively dead,
Yes.
because both sides, even the Arab Palestinian side is less interested than they've ever been. And certainly the Jews, the Israelis are justly very, 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 very dubious of the possibility of any progress on that front.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a big topic of conversation. What will happen when the war is over, or you know, how will Israel approach Gaza? I don't think it's such a huge topic of conversation in Israel because they have, their immediate needs that they're thinking about. But it did come up from time to time, and there were a variety of opinions. But I certainly think that it's decades, decades of damage have been done by this. Um, both of those soldiers mentioned that, a lot of Gazan civilians came through as well. It wasn't just the terrorists, that once the gates were open, so-called civilians flooded in and perpetrated brutality and violence. Mm. One of the guys said, he was asked, what he thought about this and why it happened. And he said, it's funny after 4,000 years to ask why. There's just evil in the world. That's just the reality. And you just have to kind of accept that and be realistic about it and do your best to protect yourself from it. And he was an interesting guy. He was a religious guy, and his perspective on that, his perspective on the idea of miracles happening in battle, and he was kind of funny about that too. He said, "Well, look, terrible things happen too. The same hand that protects you can also hurt you." And he had a very philosophical outlook. But one thing is for certain is that he knew what his role was, and his role was to protect himself, to protect his country, and to protect the Jewish people. And that's exactly what he did at great personal expense. We also got to meet with the troops that were stationed at Gush Etzion. They've turned a dining hall there into essentially barracks. And, they talked about the West Bank. In their opinion, the divide between Gaza and the West Bank is not what we are told it is in American media. Their West Bank, they're maybe not officially Hamas, but oftentimes have the same attitudes towards Israel that they do in Gaza. And these soldiers have to go in daily and foil potential terrorist attacks and terrorist plots. There's some real fighting going on there. And it's a dangerous and difficult job as well.
Yeah, and the reason why they haven't had elections there since 2005, the Mahmoud Abbas is on, they say, year 18 of his 4-year term.
Right.
The reason why is because Hamas would win. Hamas would win.
Yep.
Which they actually won the democratic elections in 2007.
Mm-hmm.
Because when Israel pulled out unilaterally in 2005, in Gaza, that is, it was the Palestinian Authority.
Yep.
And then they had elections and Hamas won. Hamas would win today in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria as well. So
yeah,
I don't know what the solution is, but the party line solution of a two-state solution, right? But that, I think it's naive and it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, the idea that you could pull out of the West Bank,
it's absurd.
It's absurd because it will be the same thing that happened in Gaza, which is that they'll spend all of their time, energy, and money building up their ability to murder Jews. They won't do anything else.
Yeah, and the distance between Gaza and the farthest penetration of terrorists on October 7th, that is much smaller than the distance between Tulkarem in the West Bank and Tel Aviv.
Yes.
So it's just not an option. It's not an option to allow these people, which are, again, effectively they're the same people.
Yeah. Land for
You should
peace.
not allow a Hamas stand in the West Bank in Judea and Samaria.
Yeah. I think land for peace is dead. And someone I read recently said, it's really land for war. And that's the mentality, that the Palestinians and their leadership has, is that, give an inch, take a mile. The more you give, the more they assume that you're weak, the more they're going to want to take. So there will be no land for peace. I don't know what the solution is to Judea and Samaria, or Gaza for that matter, but it certainly isn't exchanging land for peace or some kind of temporary tranquility. And the Israelis know that. They know that more than they ever have. And so I think that they'll likely find some other way of securing their homeland and securing their safety. I don't know what that is yet.
Otherwise, they have no reason to exist.
Yes.
And they should all be booted from office and let people that can do that.
Yeah. And, that's another interesting aspect of this, is to talk to these soldiers and citizens, the amount of pressure that I think they will apply to whatever government they have after this. And that's yet to be seen as well. I think the general sentiment is that there is no way that even Bibi can thread this needle and survive this. Though I think that they think that he will try, and he will try by blaming other people for what happened. But I think they believe
it's very hard to imagine how anyone who was in power will survive the inquiry that's going to happen after this war. Very hard.
Yeah, very hard to imagine that.
But again, that's a subject for another time.
Yeah. But, that's the feeling of the Israelis, and we'll have to see who they elect after. That evening, we had another dinner at Aish, and we heard from a young man whose grandmother was on the trip, actually from Denver, and he is an American. He moved to Israel. He was in the army. He's a Golani. He's one of the elite fighting forces who fights in the north. He was a real character. I think he's a construction foreman in New York, and he was in the Dominican Republic vacationing when he heard, and immediately got on a plane to come to Israel to, participate in the fighting effort. And he said the vibe on the plane, he said people barely talked. Everybody was going back to reserves, and they were talking about, what they might be encountering. He was saying it was really, really a powerful experience. And he got back, he suited up, he met his unit, and immediately he was on the battlefield, and bombs were dropping all around him. And he loved it. He loved every minute of it. He said it was great. He said a really incredible thing, which is that at one point in the battle, they were climbing a hill and they started to dig trenches. And they were digging trenches in the scars of trenches that have been dug there in previous wars, going back all the way to the 48 war, I believe, where they were. I could have that wrong, but just to think about the generations of Jewish soldiers who have risked their lives and fought and died protecting Israel and Israeli citizens. It was a really powerful moment thinking about that. And even going back to biblical times, this was the same land that ancient Jewish soldiers were fighting to protect, the same hills, the same valleys, the same cities. Really incredible to hear that from someone who's doing that now.
And hopefully we will witness times of Messiah when these wars will come to an end, because they're not over yet.
Amen. Amen. We asked him what he needed. He needed 2 drones. Drones was a big way for them to protect themselves. They could see the battlefield. They could see where the enemy was. It's very difficult, I guess, from where they're located to see that. So he needed $17,000. We raised it in the room. And
Wow.
we'll be sending him drones soon if they're not already on the way. Very specific type of drone that he needed. And so hopefully we have contributed to saving the lives of him and his fellow soldiers. And, you know, there's a war happening in the north. There is a war with Lebanon. You know, you read about it in the newspaper and it sounds like skirmishes, or it's a war. It's a real war. People are really, you know, soldiers are dying up there. It's difficult. It's dangerous. It's scary. It's the real thing. So even though, you know, as you mentioned, you know, some of these other fronts were supposed to open up simultaneously, and for whatever reason they didn't, there's still real fighting. And it's important for us to recognize that and make sure we're supporting those soldiers as well. For Shabbat, we got to go to Beit Knesset Hanasi, the shul of Rabbi Beryl Wine, which is, you know, just a modest shul in Jerusalem, like so many others you'd see. Rabbi Wine gave a fantastic sermon. They had a little kiddush for us after. I had the potato kugel, which was very delicious. They didn't have enough. I was still so hungry. I asked the guy if he had more. He said he did not. I was so disappointed, but I had to share with everybody else. So that's what I did. And then we went up and Rabbi Wine gave another talk, which was, I have to say, a hair-raising moment. He is so brilliant. Everything he said was so spot on. He knows exactly what is happening. You know, his talk kind of was about, you know, he said, someone asked me what I think about the state of American Jewry. I won't go into quoting everything he said. I did everything I could to remember as much of it as possible. And I started as soon as it was done, I talked to everybody. I said, whatever you remember, as soon as Shabbat is over, write it down. We need to reconstruct this talk because it was so incredible. But you know, he's 89 years old. He's a professional historian as well as a rabbi. His historical sense of, you know, his ability to put what's happening now in historical context, not only what's happening in Israel, but what's happening to American Jews, his understanding of what's happened in academia and how long it's been going on, what it will take to reverse that, whether or not we should be living in America or the United States. You know, just brilliant, just, you know, totally contemporary understanding. You know, he made several references to things that are very topical, that, you know, you might be talking about now as a young person. Really remarkable guy, totally sharp, and really a treasure. And when I reconstruct his talk, I'll send it to you.
Part two of our episodes.
Yeah, exactly. On Sunday, we went to Har Herzl, which is the memorial for the fallen soldiers. Again, like Shura, just people who aren't on the battlefield, but who take their job with the utmost seriousness and realize the effect they have on the families of the fallen. And incredibly dignified people, conscientious people, really another amazing and moving experience. And there, of course, you know, this is a difficult time for them. They interact with a lot of families of fallen soldiers and have to comfort them and have to make sure that these families know that their family members who died are going to be forever remembered. And it's really remarkable because they have a brick. If you've ever been there, it's kind of a spiral museum that you start from the bottom, you walk to the top, and there are other aspects to it. There's a cemetery, but the main part, you know, and it's constructed of bricks. And these bricks are only held together with their own weight. There's no cement or anything. And each brick has a name of every person who has died defending Israel since before the state was formed, from the first person they know who died to the most recent. The youngest was a 9-year-old kid who died in 1948. The first one, I think it was from like maybe 1917, if I'm not mistaken. He was defending one of the first communities built outside of the old city of Jerusalem. And sadly, now every day they are adding another brick and having another memorial service, or several usually. After that, we visited the Knesset. Really neat to be in that building with all its history. I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to politicians and government. We did meet with Amir Ohana. I didn't glean any new insights other than he has made sure to tell us that he's personally responsible for securing Israel's relationships with their supporters. But it was, it was good to be in that building. And there's a giant Chagall tapestry, which was really beautiful, and it's a really nice building. I was much more sympathetic to all the other people, the non-politicians who work in that building and make sure that the wheels of government can turn, such as they do. And that was the end of my part of the trip. They did have another banquet at Aish that night, which I had to miss because I wanted to see members of my family who I hadn't yet got a chance to see. I have some family that lives in Jerusalem. This is my mother's first cousins. They made Aliyah in the 70s. They live in Harnof, which is a religious neighborhood. They have a lot of kids and lots of grandkids, many of whom are serving, including one of their sons who I met with later. But they talked about, I think one of their daughters or granddaughters is in the unit that watches the screens of the cameras that look at the border with Gaza. They give this job to girls because boys aren't capable of looking at a screen for 12 hours without being distracted. So I think it's an all-female unit. And from what I hear, I have heard that actually, these young women are very upset because they had been giving warnings that they had been seeing unusual activity, and their commanders, who are mostly men, were not listening to them or taking them seriously enough. But one of my cousins is in that unit, or my second cousins, or maybe even third cousins. I'm not sure if it was their daughter or their granddaughter. It must have been their granddaughter who's in that unit. And they're very worried. They told me, my cousin told me, she says a lot of Tehillim to make sure that her grandson doesn't go to battle. And he said to her, "Grandma, you got to stop doing that. Like, I want to go. Don't pray so much for me," because they keep telling him that he's going to have to, report for duty, and then they call him at the last minute and say, "Never mind, you don't have to report." He said, "Grandma, your prayers are too effective. Stop saying it." And then I met with one of their sons, my cousin, who he was an F-16 pilot, which is kind of like a royalty in Israel. And he had to stop doing that for reserve duties because it's very demanding. It takes it's like 6 months a year of training to keep up with it. And he has a tech startup. He has a startup that uses AI and machine learning to increase the accuracy of actuarial data for insurance companies. And so he's not able to fly, but he is a reservist, and I met him that night, and he had to report for duty the next morning. He had just come from a previous shift. What he does is he communicates the needs of ground troops for air cover to the Air Force. So he speaks both languages. He speaks Army and he speaks Air Force. And then he has to make the decision of whether or not to provide the requested air cover based on how dangerous he feels it will be for the ground troops. Very demanding.
One of the hallmarks of the Army in the last couple of years is that this is what I remember hearing, is that the ground troops can summon an aerial attack on a building or someplace like that, someplace that's giving them trouble. They can just call in the Air Force.
Yes, and he's the guy that they call.
Interesting.
It's a tough job because you're making life and death decisions. You have to make them quickly. You have to weigh all sorts of factors. And he has 12-hour-long shifts. He says sometimes he can't get up to go pee or eat or anything. He's glued to his chair. Very demanding, very stressful. And again, all he wanted to talk about was his business. I wanted to hear about, his Army life, and all he wanted to talk about was his startup, which he can't wait to get back to. And, he told me about the measures that they take, to account for his absence, and, who takes over when he's not there. He, I think, is the CEO. I think he's the CEO or the CFO. I can't remember his exact role, but he's one of the founders. It's very important to him. He's been working on it for a long time. And, the way that they balance real life, I don't know what's more real life than going to war, but their regular lives with their lives as soldiers and as warriors, it was really incredible to see that. I mean, it's just the way that they handle this dichotomy is really impressive. His kids were asleep. He had just put his kids to sleep, so I didn't get to meet them. And they were sleeping in the next room. His wife came back. She had been, out to dinner with some friends for her birthday. He explained to me, I asked him, how he handles Torah study. He told me about his Torah study group that he hosts at his house every week. And, they do Gemara, and, it
seems like they have such rich lives.
Unbelievably rich lives. I mean, they are human beings in the fullest sense of the word. Families, businesses, warriors, citizens. I mean, just incredible people. And I have just, incredible respect for them.
So Blake, summarize your trip for us and tell us your takeaways.
My takeaway is this. I think is it in Ezekiel where it says, be a light unto the nations, or Isaiah?
Isaiah, yeah.
Isaiah. And I've wondered what that means. And as I've gotten older, I've come to understand what that means as I've learned more Torah, thank God, through your podcasts. And, I've learned a lot of Torah from you. Thank you so much for that. I listen to all of your podcasts. I started out listening to your history podcast, and from there I found all the others. And you really,
gateway drug.
It's the gateway drug. And it certainly was for me. And so as I've developed an understanding of what that means, of what Judaism and what Torah and what a Jewish lifestyle can offer to the world, that on this trip came into such sharp focus for me. From the Shura Army base where they prepare the bodies, to the attitudes of the warriors who go out and risk their lives, to the way that the community supports those soldiers by volunteering their time, and the selflessness that everybody shows. Every aspect is a Kiddush Hashem. Every aspect is modeling for the world how to be a mensch, how to be a human being. And when you see the mirror image of that, which is the enemy, and how the enemy behaved towards other human beings, how the enemy treats their own kin, their own countrymen, their own co-religionists, the way that they put their own people in harm's way intentionally. When you see that, and those two ways of looking at the world reflected against one another, you really see what it means to be a light unto the nations. And then to see the variety of people contributing to this, from the secular to the religious, from the left to the right, all the ways of being religious. I asked one of my taxi drivers if he was religious, and he said, no, but I know there's a God. The Jewish people we are a prism, and God's light refracts through that prism, and we're each a facet of that prism. And I felt like that on this trip. I felt like I had a direct role in allowing God's light to flood the world. And to anybody listening to this, again, I would implore you to be involved, even if you can't go to Israel. If you can, go. They want you there. They need you there. It's important not only to be there, but then to come back and share what you saw and tell other Jews and non-Jews what you've seen and how important it is. But if you can't go, anything that you do, whether it is praying or donating money or talking to people who are curious about what's going on, anything you do is really important. So yeah, that's what I learned. That's what was brought home to me on this trip, and it was life-changing.
Blake, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast and sharing the incredible stories and experiences of your trip. Even though we're far away, our hearts are there, and now we get a real sense of what things are actually like there on the ground. We went from all the different elements, the soldiers that you met, civilians that you met, the volunteer work that you did, and the takeaways that you drew. It really brought us there to a certain extent, and we appreciate that. And this is your first appearance on the podcast. Please God, you'll come back. Once you get the bug, you get the taste, you're like, I can't stop. So
amazing. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for everything you do. Torch is awesome. You're awesome. And
thank you. And hopefully we'll hear good news from our brethren in the land of Israel and the soldiers and the hostages. We hope to only hear good news from them. And again, Yasher Koach for going, because you said you represented Denver. I think you represented also the podcast, because you were a podcast listener there.
Absolutely.
And we appreciate that. And again, our nation's at war, and we may feel far away from that here in the United States, but it's important to empathize, to sympathize with our brothers and sisters. And I will join your call. If someone can go, they should go, and every one of us should do what we can to help advance the efforts. Thank you so much, Blake Cohen, for joining us, and I'm looking forward to our next opportunity.
Thank you.